You remember when you became a socialist?
Pretty much, yeah.
What year?
Well, I know when I decided that I supported the victory of the Labour Party, which, as you know, is a very different thing, but that was in 1964. And I've been reading a lot of Orwell. I've been reading actually, the thing that had more influence on me almost than anything was the poetry of Wilfred Owen.
Who is he?
He was the great poet of the First World War. He wrote a wonderful poem called Anthem for Doomed Youth, and another, just a Latin title, Dulce et Decorum Est, that's on all war memorials, sweet and seemly to die for the country. Fantastically powerful anti-war poetry written from the trenches. And very tragically, he was killed, I think on the very last day of the First World War, or the day before. The very last moments of the nightmare. His mother got the telegram about his death as the church bells were tolling for victory in 1918. And it had a tremendous effect on me reading that. Another book, which some people may remember, called How Green Was My Valley, by the Welsh mining valleys, introduced me to the idea, which had been strange to me up till then, of there being such a thing actually as a working class, with, as it were, a life and mind of its own. And you can't be a socialist if you don't think that.
When did you start writing and enjoying it, or do you enjoy writing?
I don't really know if I do or not. I mean, I hate not writing, I know that, and I sort of do it because I feel I have to. Sometimes it's real pleasure doing it. Usually the pleasure comes, though, when you see it in print. Not until then.
Where do you write?
And usually not till some time after.
Where do you write? Well,
I write a column every month for Vanity Fair called Cultural Elite.
Where? Physically?
Oh, I'm sorry. I write on a table at home in longhand.
When we see this picture, though, is this what you look like when you're writing? A cigarette in hand and
Yeah, I sometimes write in bars, too, in the afternoons.
In bars?
Yeah, I go out and find the corner of a bar. I quite like, if the noise isn't directed at me, in other words, if it's not a phone ringing or a baby crying or something, I quite like it if the jukebox is on and people are shouting the odds about a sports game. I just hunched over a bottle in the corner, and I write in longhand anyway, so I can do it anywhere, sometimes in airport terminals. And then when I've got enough down, I start to type it out, editing it as I go. I don't use any of the new technology stuff.
Do you have a technique that gets people's attention? I mean, is there something...
Oh, I should ask you.
Well, there's a headline on it. Here's one. Let's try this one on. I didn't even know where this one was published. I'll find out here.
I trust it to fall open at a good page.
Newsday, July 1990. How often did you write for Newsday?
Oh, I used to do a book column for them every week.
This is called A Pundit Who Need Never Dine Alone.
That's George Will.
George Will.
Yes.
And you start off here by saying, study and ponder the following lines written by George F. Will as Ronald Reagan went tottering back to his California estate in 1989. And then you go on to lambast him for writing what you said is basically unintelligible.
Well, I think George Will's stuff is very affected and overwritten. Yes, it's full of, I think, rather bogus shows of learning and classical tags and things of this kind. I have a weakness sometimes for quotations of that sort myself, so I think I recognize the disease in others, and it's in a very advanced stage in his case. But I think he's a courtier. I think, especially during the Reagan era, he basically was making a living as a professional flatterer of the Ron and Nancy court. And I think I don't think journalists should do that. I think it's even more important not to do it when your friends are in power.
Speaking of
what's wrong with it?
Yeah.
Well, I think for one thing, it'll congest your style very badly. You'll be full of things you can't really say, things that are half confidences that have been given to you by people in power. Your stuff will start to puff up. Your paragraphs will start to get rotund with all the things you could say if you really wanted, but you can only hint. That's bad. It's bad intellectually, and I think it's bad morally. It means that you become, your contract is no longer with your readers. And what I try and do, and the reason I write in longhand and write in isolation, is to say the only person I have a deal with is the person who might read this, and I'll give them my best. I don't care what the editor thinks, the advertising department thinks, friends and colleagues think. You try and live as it were as if none of those people counted. I think, what's the best account I can give the customers of this? Most of Washington punditry is nothing of the kind. It's private letters written to other pundits and appearing in public space.
Have you done as well in this business as you expected to?
Better than I expected to. Better than I expected to. Not as well as I would have once or twice been believed by my teachers, who were always telling me, come on, Hitchens, you shouldn't be sitting there mouldering, you should be Daniel Defoe or something. So they held me to impossible standards. But Better than I expected. Yeah.
Can you make a decent living?
Partly because there isn't in this country decent living. Yes. Yeah. America's very generous to people who write on the whole. If they keep at it, I mean, there are rewards for it. There are people who are willing to print it and pay you.
Are there people who genuinely dislike you that you come in contact with?
There ought to be by now. I mean, I've certainly done my best. If I didn't have enemies, probably people I don't know about as well as those I do, I would have obviously failed. I would have meant I hadn't been drawing blood when I had certainly meant to.
How do you know when you've gotten to people?
Well, sometimes they will come up to you and speak.
You ever had a confrontation?
Sure.
There was some confrontation you had on a television show one time. Well,
that was with Ed Meese. But
got a little physical?
I thought it was going to get physical, as a matter of fact. Yes, I thought he was I thought it was just such a disgrace that such a man could be the Attorney General in a country that has a Justice Department. I had to tell him everything I thought about him, and he wasn't, which is not my fault, used to hearing that kind of thing. Look, I mean, this is a bit of a digression, but the scandal that he helped cover up, the Iran-Contra scandal, was also covered up, of course, and lied about by both Ronald Reagan and George Bush. Reagan did say one truthful thing about it. He said, if it wasn't for that rag in Beirut, we'd never have had all this trouble. And I thought that was true. If it wasn't for a newspaper in Beirut, the Iran-Contra scandal never would have come to light. And yet, how many journalists would you say there are in Washington? Well paid, well informed, well connected. Thousands of them, who never broke the story. A lot of them didn't believe it even when it came out. That's a pretty tremendous indictment.
What do you think of...
And so I try, as far as I can, not to get too accustomed to, the culture of journalism, because I think it's likely to be the outsiders that will do the best work.
But you said you were social.
I like to go to gatherings, and I like to meet the people firsthand. I always liked that. That's why I used to go to the Oxford Union when I was at the university and debate against actual politicians and try and have dinner with them afterwards, because you very swiftly found out it was very good for your education, that they didn't really know very much more than you did, and they weren't that much smarter. It was a good way of demystifying politics.
Looking at something called How Neoconservatives Perish.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember this one?
Sure.
By the way, did you select all these? Was this your choice?
Well, I mean, I threw out the ones that I didn't think could possibly be reprinted, because they either were no good, which was true in an awful number of cases, or that they'd gone out of time. They were written just for that week or that day and wouldn't survive. So the ones that could bear reprinting, I made a pile. Then I gave that to an editor and said, you decide which ones you think would make the cut. So I left that to them.
How many books do you have to sell to be successful with this?
I have no idea. I've never got... It's a figure larger than any book I've ever written has ever sold. Most of my books don't make back the money, the small sum of money that I'm paid to write them. I don't know why. I don't have any knack there at all. It's a wonder, in fact. I mean, there are very, very few publishers these days who will take a risk on a book that won't make money. And I'm probably exhausting the patience of...
This is Verso Publishing?
Yeah, well, that's the publishing arm of New Left Books. It's a very fine publishing firm, by the way. It's published some wonderful books, but it has to take permanent risks on opposition writing and unknown writers. I mean, they probably would never let me down, but increasingly the mainstream publishing industry, I think, wants an assurance up front that everything's commercial and that you've got a tie-in of some sort of serialization or maybe a movie deal, and I'm no good at that. I wish I was.
In this piece in Harper's in 1990, How Neoconservatives Perish, you talk about keywords and phrases uttered with the proper sneer. Disinformation, dupe, ripe fruit, choke point, fellow traveler, fifth columnist, Chamberlain's umbrella, captive nation, peace through strength, moral equivalence.
Yeah, don't you remember what it was like?
Here?
Don't you remember what a sort of hooligan atmosphere there was in American intellectual life for a long time because of the Cold War, that anyone who had any doubts that this war was worth fighting and worth the risk of a nuclear exchange was accused of being a dupe or a secret sympathizer or a sort of a fan of Neville Chamberlain's umbrella or all these other things. It was people were constantly being crushed and coerced and derided and sort of driven out of the argument, and I wanted to put that down before people forget it.
All these people were ostensibly there, meaning a conference of conservatives, neoconservatives, to take personal credit for the final collapse of communism, why then do they look and sound so lost and deflated like a herd of ants in search of a climax?
No, it's a herd of antis in search of a climax.
Excuse me, my eyes are bad.
Well, no, maybe there's a misprint.
No, you're right.
It's supposed to be a herd of antis in search of a climax. Well, I was convinced that partly because they had lost their willingness, not their willingness, they had lost their ability to be able to bully and blackmail the opposition and accuse it of treachery and sympathy for the other side, that was one of the reasons that the right wing is nostalgic for the Cold War, that it's lost its free pass as being the patriots where everyone else is disloyal. It's not the whole thing. I mean, they've also lost a lot of their subsidies, which I think makes them squeal even louder. These people used to have very fat foundations supporting any project of theirs, however mediocre or crack-potted. Now they don't have that anymore. And we're also beginning to count the cost of the Cold War to the United States, which is pretty enormous, to say nothing of the damage that it did to other countries around the world.